Life during medieval winters was basically nature's way of saying, good luck with that. While fairy tales loved to show us scenes of cozy castles and warm fireplaces, the reality for peasants was more like living in the world's worst freezer. When you had to wake up before sunrise in a house that felt colder than your neighbor's attitude, you knew you were in for a rough day. And to really put this in perspective, while today we complain about our heating bill, or when the thermostat drops below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, medieval peasants had it rough. According to historical records, winter temperatures in medieval Europe could plummet to bone-chilling levels, sometimes hitting 0 degrees Fahrenheit in places like England and northern France. That's cold enough to freeze your boots to the ground, which actually happened more often than you'd think. The daily grind started before sunrise, with peasants dragging themselves out of their freezing beds to tend to animals or whatever tasks needed doing. One medieval writer noted that peasants would often wake up with frost on their eyebrows. Talk about a medieval alarm clock. Speaking of beds, you wouldn't believe what passed for sleeping arrangements back then, because their beds were basically giant piles of hay and straw thrown together on the floor, the medieval version of a DIY project gone wrong. But these makeshift beds actually work better than you might expect. Recent archaeological studies of medieval peasant homes have shown that these hay beds could be up to 2 feet thick. That's like having a king-size mattress made entirely of farm leftovers. The peasants would collect fresh hay during the summer months, storing extra bundles specifically for winter bedding. They'd layer it thick enough to keep them off the cold ground, which was crucial since most peasant homes had dirt floors that turned into mini freezers during winter. Every morning they'd have to shake out their bedding. And boy, could that lead to some interesting surprises. From mice making cozy nests overnight to bugs treating their bed like an all-you-can-eat buffet, peasants never knew what they might find. One medieval text mentions a peasant who found a chicken had laid an egg in his bed while he was sleeping. Talk about breakfast in bed. But the real genius of hay beds was their natural insulation properties. When packed tightly, hay could trap air pockets that worked like nature's bubble wrap, keeping warmth from escaping into the cold ground below. The peasants would often layer their hay with whatever else they could find: old clothes, worn-out blankets, and even dried moss. During particularly cold nights, they'd rotate fresh hay from their storage into their beds because compressed hay lost its insulating properties over time. The downside? Hay beds were basically giant sponges for moisture. In the damp medieval climate, they could get pretty musty. And if you had allergies, well, let's just say antihistamines weren't exactly available at the local apothecary. One historical account describes a nobleman who had to spend a night in a peasant's home, and he complained for weeks about how the hay bed made him sneeze so much he thought his nose would fall off. But hay beds weren't just for sleeping, they doubled as seating during the day. When visitors came over, if they ever did, everyone would sit around on these hay piles like they were medieval beanbags, though I doubt anyone was calling them rustic chic back then. And while these beds might sound uncomfortable, at least they had one advantage over modern mattresses: bed bugs preferred fabric to hay. But there was one material that medieval peasants practically lived in during winter. Yes, it's wool. It was basically the medieval version of a superhero suit, except instead of fighting crime, it fought hypothermia. Medieval peasants relied on wool so much that historians estimate a single family might have owned up to 20 pounds of wool clothing. That's about the weight of a small child, except this child kept you warm and occasionally made you itch like crazy. The truly fascinating thing about wool was how peasants got it. Each spring, local shepherds would shear their sheep, and peasants would buy or trade for the raw wool. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just throw it on like we do with modern wool sweaters. The wool had to be processed, which meant hours of cleaning, carding, and spinning. And you thought doing laundry today was a pain. Here's a fun fact that'll make you appreciate your modern clothes. Medieval wool still contained lanolin, the natural oil from sheep that made the fabric water-resistant. Sure, it smelled like wet sheep when it rained, but at least the water rolled right off. Some clever peasants figured out that leaving extra lanolin in the wool meant they stayed drier, though they probably weren't winning any medieval fashion contests or getting invited to the castle for dinner. But medieval peasants rarely washed their wool clothes, and for once, they actually had a good reason. Wet wool in freezing temperatures? That's a recipe for becoming a human popsicle. One medieval record tells of a peasant who washed his wool coat in winter and found it frozen solid enough to stand up on its own. After that, it became a local joke. as stiff as John's winter washing. But the wool wasn't perfect. For one thing, it attracted fleas like nobody's business. Medieval peasants would often hang their wool clothes near the smoke from their fires, hoping the smoke would drive away the tiny unwanted roommates. The downside? They ended up smelling like a combination of sheep and campfire. Medieval peasant perfume, if you will. The magic of wool showed up during the worst winter storms. While modern tests have shown that wet wool can still keep you warm even when soaking wet, it maintains about 80% of its insulating power. Peasants didn't need scientists to tell them this. They lived it. They'd trudge through snowstorms looking like walking haystacks, wrapped in layer after layer of the stuff. But one piece of wool clothing was never enough in the brutal medieval winters. These crafty peasants had a solution that would make any modern fashionista cringe. Because in the medieval world, the fashion motto was simple. If you can still move your arms, you haven't put on enough clothes yet. Peasants didn't just wear layers, they mastered the art of looking like a walk-in closet. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites shows that the average peasant would wear between 4 to 7 layers of clothing during the coldest days, which probably made them look like they'd raided every clothesline in the village. Let's break down this medieval outfit extravaganza. First came the base layer, a long linen shirt that reached down to their knees. On top of that, they'd add a wool tunic, then another tunic, because why stop at one? Followed by a jerkin, that's just a fancy name for a sleeveless jacket. If they were lucky enough to own one, they'd throw on a fur-lined cloak. The whole ensemble was often tied together with a rope belt, which was less about fashion and more about keeping all those layers from sliding off. But getting dressed was like a daily workout. One medieval account describes a peasant who got so tangled in his layers that his wife had to roll him around the room like a barrel until he popped free. And you thought putting on skinny jeans was hard. The medieval peasants were actually onto something with all these layers. Modern scientists have found that multiple thin layers trap warm air better than one thick layer. The peasants figured this out through trial and error. Mostly error probably, and a lot of frozen toes along the way. The real challenge came when nature called. With all those layers, a quick trip to the outhouse turned into an epic adventure. Records from the time mention people avoiding drinking water in winter just to skip the whole undressing, redressing ordeal. Talk about dedication to staying warm. Kids had it especially tough. Parents would wrap them in so many layers that they'd waddle around like tiny drunk penguins. One medieval writer joked that you could always spot the children in winter. They were the round bundles rolling down the village hills because they couldn't bend their knees to walk properly. Even with all these layers, peasants still needed something else to keep warm. That's where the most important feature of any medieval home came in. A feature that could either save your life or fill your lungs with smoke. A fireplace, if you could even call it that. Really, it was just a fire pit in the middle of the room with smoke going wherever it pleased. Medieval architects hadn't quite figured out the whole chimney thing yet, which meant most homes had a lovely ambiance of constantly smoked meat, including the people inside. Archaeological digs have revealed something interesting, and that is the average medieval home had a fire pit about 3 feet in diameter, surrounded by stones, but only about 15% of the heat actually stayed in the room. The rest? It went straight up through the holes in the roof, which were supposed to let the smoke out, but mostly just let snow in. Medieval peasants basically invented the world's most inefficient heating system. The fun started when it came to finding fuel. Forget nice, dry firewood. That was for the rich folks. Peasants burned whatever they could get their hands on. Old furniture? In the fire? Last year's broken tools? Perfect fuel. Your neighbor's fence that mysteriously disappeared overnight? Hey, what happens in medieval winter stays in medieval winter. Records from one English village show that a group of peasants once burned an entire abandoned barn, piece by piece, throughout a particularly harsh winter. The local lord wasn't too happy about that one. Getting the fire started each morning was a whole adventure. They'd keep a single coal alive overnight, buried in ashes. Losing it meant a very cold trek to borrow fire from a neighbor. One medieval story tells of a man who had to carry a hot coal home in a hollowed-out turnip because he had nothing else to transport it in. He ran so fast to keep it alive that people thought he was being chased by demons. The smoke was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, it made everyone's eyes water and probably took years off their lives, but it also kept the bugs away and accidentally preserved the roof beams. Modern analysis of surviving medieval timbers shows they were actually protected by the layers of soot that built up over years. It's probably not a preservation method you'll find in today's home improvement guides. Each family had their own tricks for managing the fire. Some would sleep in shifts to keep it going through the night. Others developed elaborate systems of banking the coals just right. Many believed that if you whispered to the fire while adding fuel, it would burn better, though that might have just been the smoke making them a bit loopy. After a long day of trying not to freeze or suffocate from smoke, medieval peasants needed something to warm their insides too. Their dinner menu. Medieval winter meals were like playing a really weird version of What's in the Pot? Research shows that the average peasant family had about 7 to 8 basic ingredients they used all winter long, and most of them were root vegetables that looked like they'd been grown in a dragon's garden. Turnips, parsnips, and something called neeps, which honestly sounds more like a medieval disease than a vegetable, were the stars of the show. The cooking process was pretty much the same every day. Throw everything into a pot, add water, and pray it turns into something edible. This pot would hang over the fire all day long, with family members tossing in whatever they could find. Historians have found records of some truly creative additions: tree bark for fiber, pebbles for minerals, and even leather for protein. One medieval record mentions a family who got so desperate they tried cooking their wooden spoon, claiming it added flavor. But these peasants were surprisingly clever with their winter food storage. They'd preserve everything they could during summer and fall. Vegetables were packed in sand or stored in cool, dark places. Meat, when they could get it, was heavily salted or smoked. Some families became so good at food preservation that their neighbors would offer trades for their expertise. 3 turnips for your secret meat smoking technique was apparently a real bargain back then. But it's also interesting how they use wild herbs and plants. Medieval peasants were like walking encyclopedias of edible plants. They knew exactly which winter herbs could make their stews taste better, or at least mask the taste of that 3-day-old mystery meat. One popular herb was something called poor man's pepper, a plant that grew wild and could make even a boot taste decent if you used enough of it. But the winner of winter cooking were the herbs they dried during summer. Every house had bundles hanging from the rafters, making the place look like a medieval apothecary. These weren't just for flavor. Many had medicinal properties that helped fight off winter illnesses. Though given how much smoke they were breathing in from their fires, they probably needed all the medicinal help they could get. At night, families would gather around their perpetual stew pot, sharing the day's gossip and trying not to think about what might be floating in their dinner. But they weren't alone in their cozy homes. They had some unexpected roommates keeping them warm. Because studies of medieval house layouts show that up to 30% of living space was shared with animals during winter. That's right. Chickens, pigs, sheep, and even cows became temporary indoor roommates when temperatures dropped. These animal arrangements weren't random. Each creature had its own special heating properties. Cows, for example, could generate as much heat as a small fireplace, around 5,000 BTUs per hour. Medieval peasants didn't know what BTUs were, but they knew that sleeping near Bessie, the cow, meant waking up with all their toes still attached. Pigs were like portable heaters, chickens were feathered foot warmers, and sheep were basically walking blankets. Of course, this setup came with some interesting challenges. You haven't experienced true chaos until you've tried eating dinner with a curious pig trying to stick its snout in your bowl. Archaeological evidence shows that many peasant homes had low barriers built to keep animals in certain areas. Though based on historical accounts, these barriers were more like polite suggestions that the animals completely ignored. The nighttime symphony was something special too. Between the cows mooing, the pigs snoring, and the chickens' random midnight announcements, medieval peasants probably invented sleeping through noise out of pure necessity. One funny account from a traveling merchant describes staying at a peasant's house and being convinced the rooster had a personal grudge against him. It kept crowing directly in his ear every time he dozed off. But these animal roommates served multiple purposes. Besides being living heaters, they provided an early warning system against thieves trying to sneak past a paranoid goose, and their breath helped keep the room humid, which actually made it feel warmer. Scientists have confirmed that a properly humid room feels 3 to 4 degrees warmer than a dry one. Those medieval peasants might not have known the science, but they knew it worked. Some peasants even developed specific housing rules for their animals. Chickens might get the window spots to catch the first light and wake everyone up, while larger animals stayed near the back wall where their body heat could reflect off the stone. It was like a medieval version of a homeowners association, just with more manure to deal with. As clever as these indoor arrangements were, peasants still needed to protect themselves from the brutal winter weather when they ventured outside. Their solution? They turned their homes into mini fortresses against the cold using some pretty creative building techniques. Because they took their typical medieval house, cut it in half, and buried the bottom part underground. This clever design provided extra insulation, keeping the cold at bay while they huddled inside. Archaeological digs have uncovered evidence that nearly 40% of peasant homes in northern Europe were partially submerged in the earth. These weren't exactly luxury basement apartments, but they were onto something incredibly smart. The ground temperature stays pretty steady at about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit once you get a few feet down. Modern scientists call this geothermal stability, but medieval peasants just called it common sense. They'd dig down about 3 to 4 feet, build their walls up from there, and end up with a home that stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer. It was like having medieval air conditioning, minus the air and the conditioning. Building materials were whatever they could get their hands on. Straw, mud, stones, wood. If it could make a wall, they used it. Some particularly resourceful peasants would steal stones from old Roman ruins, leading to houses that were part medieval hovel, part ancient empire. The local lords weren't thrilled about this architectural recycling program, but hey, when you're freezing, a stone is a stone. The really clever bit was how they handled drafts. Every crack and gap was stuffed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. This medieval caulking worked surprisingly well. Tests on reconstructed houses show it could reduce heat loss by up to 60%. Plus, it gave new meaning to the phrase, "This place is a dump." Doors were another fascinating feature. Most peasant homes only had one door, and it usually faced away from the prevailing wind. This wasn't just random. It was medieval engineering at its finest. They'd often build a small entrance tunnel, kind of like what you'd see in an igloo. One medieval writer described it as entering through a dragon's throat, though given the smells from all those indoor animals, that might not have been far off. The roofs were layered like the world's thickest sandwich. Branches, straw, more straw, and sometimes even chunks of turf. In some places, peasants would let grass grow on their roofs, not because they were trying to create medieval green architecture, but because the roots helped hold everything together. Plus, their goats could graze up there if they were feeling adventurous. A well-built house was only half the battle against winter's fury. To venture outside, peasants needed a special set of tools that would make modern survival experts jealous. And boy, did they have an arsenal. Archaeological finds show that the average peasant owned about 6 to 8 essential winter tools, each one carefully maintained and passed down through generations. These weren't just tools, they were the difference between life and turning into a human icicle. The snow shovel was the king of winter tools, but it looked nothing like what we use today. Made from a single piece of hardwood with a wide, flat end, these medieval shovels were actually more efficient at moving heavy snow than modern plastic ones. Tests on recreated medieval shovels show they could move about 30% more snow per scoop. Of course, they also weighed about as much as a small child, so using one was like doing CrossFit medieval style. Thick socks were worth their weight in gold, literally. Records from one medieval market show that a pair of well-made winter socks could cost as much as a chicken. These weren't your basic wool socks either. Peasants would weave strips of rabbit fur between the wool layers, creating nature's own winter boots. One medieval writer complained that his feet were so warm in these socks, he worried they'd cook. The most fascinating tool was something called a snow scorer, a long stick used to mark paths in deep snow. Peasants would plant these sticks along common routes before big storms hit. Smart move, considering getting lost in a medieval snowstorm meant playing a very cold version of hide-and-seek that nobody wanted to win. Historical records mention one village that painted their snow scorers with different colors of berry juice to create the world's first medieval GPS system. But the real MVP of medieval winter gear was the humble mitten. Not gloves, mittens. They discovered what scientists only proved centuries later. Keeping your fingers together generates more warmth than separating them. These weren't store-bought mittens either. Peasants would stuff them with everything from dried moss to chicken feathers. One creative soul even made mittens stuffed with cat hair. Talk about recycling. The tools had to be ready at a moment's notice. Medieval weather forecasting consisted mainly of looking at the sky and hoping for the best. They did have some surprisingly accurate prediction methods, though. If the cows in the house, remember them, started getting extra cuddly, a storm was coming. When the pigs gathered extra straw, cold weather was on the way. It wasn't exactly the Weather Channel, but it worked. These clever medieval solutions showed just how resourceful people can be when survival is on the line. From underground houses to animal roommates, from perpetual stews to fur-lined socks, medieval peasants wrote their own survival guide, one freezing winter at a time.